Good morning and welcome to Sunday Forum. We're very glad you're with us, whether here in person or with us online. Just a housekeeping note before we begin. Our speaker, Mark, has said that questions are welcome anytime during his talk. And so if you want to just raise your hand, but please wait until we bring you a microphone, because otherwise our folks at home won't be able to hear the question. We're fortunate this morning to have with us an expert in one of the most critical areas in the effort to stem climate change. Mark Muller became executive director of the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation in March of 2020. Not the best time to take on a new leadership position, but the foundation could not have found anyone more uniquely qualified to lead it through difficult times as well as times of opportunity. He came from the McKnight Foundation, where he was program director of the Mississippi River Program. He helped scale up regenerative agricultural practices in the Mississippi River Basin and supported federal and state policy efforts for healthy soils and clean water. He has had a long and varied career focused on transforming our agricultural and food systems, dating back to college jobs, supporting farm workers and spending time on a diversified organic vegetable farm, and a year as a volunteer in Guatemala and Honduras. He spent 14 years with the Institute for Agricultural and Trade Policy, including directing the Food and Community Fellows, a fellowship program explicitly focused on building racial equity in the food system. Mark is just the person to help us begin to understand the complexities of the present agricultural picture. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. That probably was the kindest introduction I've ever received. I'm not sure who wrote that. Where did you get all that from? and excuse me while I get this going here. Play from start. And I need to share screen, and I hopefully. All right, is that all right, good. All right. I am not the most formal person, and so it does happen, this formality. I know it has to happen because of the online, but excuse me, because I enjoy the more informal type of conversation. I am curious, just how many of you either came from farms or rural communities where you grew up? Right, so let the audience know, about 4 or 5. I would love just to hear, what brought you, assuming that you now live in the metropolitan area, what brought you here to Minneapolis? And just more opportunity, love, as often the case, graduate school. If you could just shout out, maybe I'd just be interested in hearing that. Yeah. Right. Yeah. More opportunity, a job, husband's job. How about you, sir? Did you have something, sir? Born here. Interesting. Let the record be stated that he was born here, but then was farmed out to do the farming. And okay, how about Bryce? Did you have something, or
living elsewhere in other parts of the country, wanting to come back and settle in the Midwest?
Coming back to settle in the Midwest. So yeah, it's just an interesting combine. So I just wanted to start with that, just kind of thinking about why is it that we are here, and why is it that so many of our rural communities are somewhat struggling? You know, struggling with a lack of population, some struggles with environmental concerns, sometimes struggling with jobs, and often people just, you know, like I'd say for us, is my wife in particular was really likes coffee shops, and really likes the diversity that we have. So and I got to say, I like how much I appreciate this congregation, and I have. An awful lot of my life, you could almost throw a stone from here to different parts of my life. We lived in the Midtown Phillips neighborhood for the past 25 years, so just across the highway over there. The Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, where I was for 14 years, is corner of Franklin and Nicollet. It's not there anymore, but that's where I worked for many years. And kids went to Whittier School down the street. So this is my neighborhood. My son George, actually, think about it, he worked at Jimmy John's that was right across Franklin Avenue from here. He has stories. There are a lot of stories about what happens here. So what I have this photo that you see here of, this is from a while. Pete knows in the back that my kids don't look like that anymore. Noah's at Loyola Chicago. Maria on the left is a senior in high school. But that's my wife's family farm outside of Dubuque, Iowa. And I had a real vision of farming there. But I couldn't get it to work. I couldn't get it to work. Sorry. That photo there, I have always, in the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, we love the family farm. We talk a lot about how the family farm is kind of the basis of agriculture. I had someone that I used to work with, an African-American woman. That was kind of the first time someone said, what is it about this family farm thing? You know, why is it that you're so based on that? And it really got me thinking. It is one form of agriculture, but it is one form of agriculture. And there's many others that we can think about. So I'll just leave it at that. All right, what to cover today? First thing I want to talk about covering with regenerative agriculture is the soil. We need to cover the soil. This is one of the basic tenets of regenerative agriculture. So that's what I want to talk about, first and foremost, about some of the principles of regenerative agriculture. Then I want to talk about the scope and the challenges we have in agriculture, demonstrate some solutions to it, and finally some pathways that I can think about to get there. So, we live now in a landscape that is dangerously fragile. If you look at this here, these photos here, the green represents corn on the landscape, the yellow represents soybeans, and then everything else is a different color. You don't see a whole lot of everything else. The vast majority of what we have here in southern Minnesota, much of Iowa and Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, that's dominated by corn and soybeans. We have so many counties that are over 90% land use corn and soybeans. That's not 90% the crops are corn and soybeans, that's 90% the land use. That includes the houses and the roads and everything else. It's in corn and soybeans. When you see a cornfield in August, it's a sight to behold. It's beautiful, lush and green. You see a cornfield now? Not so much. So that is a fairly typical farm field. When you drive, down 35, out Highway 60 or something, you're going to see a lot of fields like that. Not much cover at all. So what happens when there's a big rainstorm? That soil goes with the water. That is our system right now that has real detriments to water quality, real detriments to soil health, not having a diversity on the ground there. Lack of diversity, the wealth creation, it's hard to create a whole lot of wealth when we just have a couple of crops that we have largely for export or for large manufacturing. We have a system, and I don't like to place blame or anything, but we have a system that's really not working in an awful lot of different ways. So how can we address that? What we have is a system that does, first and foremost, creates a lot of cheap calories, and a lot of calories, of a few different crops. So this is actually a friend of mine on the right that was doing, this is one of those buster years where they just had too much crop, they couldn't fit into the grain bins, and so they were just putting it out on big tarps and stuff somewhere else because there's so much corn, they didn't know what to do with it. We have an awful lot of, an abundance of a couple of crops, primarily corn and soybeans. Wheat, cotton, and rice are a few others that are in other parts of the country, but we have a lot in corn and soybeans. And then we try to figure out what to do with it all. So when we try to figure out what to do with it all, we developed a system back in the 1970s called high fructose corn syrup. Figured out how to get a lot of corn usage there. We have a lot of animals to feed. We put a lot of it into the corn and beans into the animals. We created soybean oil. Anytime you buy like a vegetable oil, it's going to either be canola oil or soybean oil. So we have these couple of crops that we use in so many different ways that wasn't before. So we have a system that we've created a lot of certain products, and then we try to figure out how to use it all. What I have found is that it's almost like you have a raft, and that raft is starting to tip a little bit. And it's tipping a little bit more and a little bit more. And we have an unbalanced landscape, and then to try to address that, we have an unbalanced economics, and we try to do things like create high fructose corn syrup, create ethanol, find different ways of using those products And then we create policies to make that happen. So we keep on trying to kind of set it up right by kind of putting different policies forward, trying to get different economic incentives to make something to work for the system that we have that isn't working all that well. So this is this unbalanced raft that keeps on getting more and more unbalanced. And this might be a little bit of a clash of analogies here, but I want to try to use this. As you look at, I would say like ethanol production is an example of essentially trying to put a sandbag on this economy, trying to figure out a way of somehow making it go better by throwing something there to stop the bad things from happening. So we keep on trying to have different ways that we're addressing the system that is out of balance. We essentially are putting sandbags down to try to make the system continue to work. What we don't really do very often is kind of ask that question, is why do we have so many floods? And I say floods literally, why do we have so many floods and droughts on the system? Why do we have prices that are either often way too high, way too low, that are driving farmers out of business? Why do we have the farm worker and the processing plant, justice atrocities that we have? We have a system that in so many ways is out of whack, and we just try to keep on kind of, Band-Aid it, put a little duct tape up there, trying to make it work a little bit better. So the system and one other thing I'll just say about that is part of what we often try to do is like, all right, let's make a bigger sandbag. Let's try to address this bigger and bigger. And I guess you can look at the Hoover Dam as one of those really big sandbags saying, we don't have enough water in the West, let's create a system to make it work. And that seemed to work fairly well for decades. That seemed to work very well. Last year, we started to get some real issues. As you see, we had the historic drought and threatening hydropower at the Hoover Dam. We're having more and more of these systems where these big, analogy of a sandbag isn't working like we would like it to happen. And I think we keep on trying to drive a system that just doesn't quite fit. It's a square peg in a round hole. That round hole is kind of having more of an ecosystem lens in what we're doing. Can we do that? And that is where I kind of think of as a regenerative agriculture, is where our hope, our future is in a regenerative agriculture that embraces what the ecosystem is telling us to do and embraces kind of having a traditional ecological knowledge. I'll talk a little bit more about that. This right here, just in terms of the climate conversation, and I apologize for putting a graph up there, but I want to make the point about there's so much that we can do. If you're thinking about climate change, addressing buildings efficiency, fuel efficiency, there are great things that we can do to tweak our systems to make them work better. Get higher fuel standards on cars, make buildings like this. We can, do different things to make it more efficient. We can make it, say, 10% more efficient by doing these type of things. So we're kind of moving along that line, moving the dot from one place to the other. That's a good way of making some success. My contention is that when we look at agriculture and the state that we are in right now in agriculture, when we have the fields that look like they do right over there about having such bare ground for so much of the year, I don't think tweaks are the solution. So I think the premise I just want to start with regenerative agriculture is that it is not about tweaking the system. It's more about going on a larger journey, or you could say more of a transformation. And you look over the next, say, quarter century, when we look at the climate crisis we're in, the health and land use issues that we're in, do we want a transactional progress or do we need more transformational change? And in my mind, it's like we need something big. We need to really be rethinking how we're doing things. So that is one kind of talk a little bit about this, about regenerative agriculture. There are many good things that are happening around regenerative agriculture where regenerative practices are being put on the ground. And many of our companies, General Mills and Cargill, have done some really impressive things about getting more regenerative practices, getting more no-till on crops, getting more cover cropping in. These are great things to happen. Where I'm spending my time is more in trying to figure out where we jump to something more transformational. I think it is a both and. We can have all those things happen, but where I think I need to spend my time is on that transformation spot. So it's kind of to continue this in a little bit of a different analogy. We have different practices, like flying a plane. We don't want someone being a maverick when they're flying a plane, saying, I can figure this out on my own. We want them to know the instruction manual. We want them to be well trained. Okay, so that's one aspect of trying to look at what we want to see. Another aspect I think of where regenerative agriculture is about how it's more of a journey. And I think the key part here is that we don't know where that journey is taking us. We don't really know who's going to participate, what path we're going to take, how hard it's going to be. We don't know the answers. I think it's really important for us to say we don't know. We don't know what the answers are. And we need to go forward, but we don't know. if you're going to just take a step or two, if we're going to make transactional change, reading the manual is a great thing to do. When we're trying to make more of the transformational change, we have to have more of that humility and just saying, yeah, I'm not quite sure. So where I have found some solace and some vision for helping as I think about how we're going to go forward and address this is to recognize that there are world visions or ways of looking at how the world works far different from how I've grown up, and I would assume like many of you have grown up. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who many of my Braiding Sweetgrass, which I think was just a phenomenal book, one of the quotes from that I loved is, some of the wisest native elders look at the land and they say, the problem with these new people is that they don't have both feet on the shore. They don't seem to know where they're staying, whether they're staying or not. A second one, Reginaldo Hazlitt Marroquin. So Rehi has been a friend of mine for 25 years. He lives down in Northfield. He was the founding director of Peace Coffee, if many of you have seen Peace Coffee throughout town, which was founded by my old organization, Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, where Rehi and I worked together. Rehi, who is from Guatemala, from the Western Highlands of Guatemala, is doing some phenomenal work that I'll talk a little bit about more, but his kind of life endeavor is to seek to lift expressions of a more indigenous way of thinking, seeing, acting, and working with nature as a foundational principle of scaling up regenerative agriculture with integrity. Far different from just getting a cookbook and saying, this is how we're going to do it. He's just saying, let's kind of look at a whole new way of thinking. So, a few different things about some potential solutions for the regenerative agriculture issue. So what Rehi is doing down in Northfield is mimicking natural ecosystems. He's starting with poultry. And the idea is that poultry, chickens are originally, they're a forest bird. They feel much more comfortable in a tree cover. That's why they roost. You know, they find somewhere to roost. They much prefer that. What Rehi's been developing is a system here where he has crops like elderberries, hazelnuts, and things that are in there with the chickens. And the chickens are roosting around there, eating grains and other things like they normally do, while also having elderberries and hazelnuts and other things that are falling from the ground, and much healthier and much happier being in that environment. So he's getting multiple crops. He has these in like very small, half acre, quarter acre, the very small plots where he incorporates the birds with the fruits and the nuts, and so they have multiple crops coming off of there. It's called tree range farms, and so they're getting in more and more in different co-ops and all that, but kind of a fascinating system that is mimicking the natural ecosystem. And as a way of having the system work better, rather than having, this is the corn ground, this is where we raise the chickens in confinement, it's all kind of coming together. I think that's one of the real principles of regenerative agriculture. So mimicking natural ecosystems, I'll put there really high in terms of what we're trying to achieve in regenerative agriculture. The perennialization of agriculture. There is some wonderful work happening, both at the University of Minnesota and at the Land Institute. How many people have heard of Kernza? I know Andy has and several. Okay. So Kernza, as many of you already know, which is very impressive, it's been developed over the course of many years, started by this gentleman, Wes Jackson, at the Land Institute. They're trying to find ways of having more of a perennial agriculture. So our agriculture is really based on annuals: corn, soybeans, wheat. These are all annual crops that we have to grow every year. We're often tilling every year. There's a lot more damage to the soil through them. Kernza is a perennial, meaning that you can plant it and it will stay there for several years and you don't have to do anything to it. One of the real advantages of having a perennial is the root structure. So Jerry Glover on the right there, he is holding up a Kernza plant. Jerry used to work for the Land Institute. Look at the size of those roots. Compare that to a corn plant or a soybean plant where you might get a few inches, or you look at your Kentucky bluegrass in your yard, you get a couple of inches there. Just many feet right there. Think of the holding capacity of the soil, the grabbing of the water, so the water doesn't run off. It's a huge benefit. And then you have ground cover, and that's Dr. Don Wise on the left with the University of Minnesota, who has been integral to this as well. And kind of it occurs a field that's there year round, providing cover year round. There's some real benefits to this. One of the things that's been pointed out also is that we want to have more things like Kernza on the landscape. We also don't want to have tens of millions of acres just of Kernza. We want to make sure that we have the diversity in that system. So one of the things also to work on is having perennials on the landscape, but also having a diversity on the landscape to make sure we keep that front and center. Yeah, please. Great question. So the question, great question, is what do you do with kernza? So kernza is actually, its name is intermediate wheatgrass. So it is a form that can be used much like wheat. I see Beth Dooley could be the one that could answer this so much better than me. So there are a variety of different efforts to use it. There's been a couple of bakeries that have been using it, make kernza waffles, kernza pancakes, kernza muffins. It's used in beer. There's a long root ale that uses kernza for the beer. General Mills has been experimenting with a cereal that uses kernza. So right now there's hundreds of acres of kernza. So it is a long ways to go before we get to the hundreds of thousands and millions of acres. But so there's lots of uses of it right now. Yeah.
Perennial kitchen, which I.
Let have Beth, please. Yes.
It's kind of like a CSA. Well, it's a kitchen. It's the, do you mean the business? The business? Yeah. Oh, pantry. I'm sorry. Printing up, but I've signed up in the past. But they have the crackers and the pancakes are fantastic. Yeah. I don't know if it still exists to be able to do, but yeah, the people might keep that in mind and look into it online.
Yeah, it was started by two young men, and they make fabulous products. And if you sign up for the CSA, you get a variety of different regenerative ag products. And so it's kernza, it's also a few of the other crops that Mark was talking about, and they have all kinds of information on the website. They also partner with Friends of the Mississippi River, and they provide, I can't remember the percentage, but some of the their profits go towards Friends of the Mississippi River to plant more kernza and have more diversity on the land. So yeah, it's a wonderful organization.
And just one thing I'll add to that, regarding your question, what do you do with kernza? I think one of the opportunities that we have in front of us is that we have figured out all sorts of ways of using corn and soybeans, a lot with the government research dollars that have found many innovative ways to use it. We are just starting to touch the potential for things like kernza, these alternative crops that haven't had that research. So the more research we get into this, the more opportunities there's going to be to use them different ways and to compete against the dominant system that we currently have. Yeah.
When you rotate the crop of this, what can you do with that wonderful root? Does it just decompose in the ground, or can you pull it out and use it for something?
As far as I know, it's just stays in the ground, and it helps nourish the soil there. Is there?
They also, it has three uses. The first one is, in the spring when it comes out, if you have animals on the land, they can graze back down, and like our grass, when you cut it, it comes back up, produces a very light wheat, and then at the end of the season, it provides forage for animals as well. So, the idea is that it stays permanently on the land, that you don't rip it up. I think it's very productive it's between 5 and 10 years. Yeah. And once it really, once it is time to bring it up, the roots just stay in the ground and decompose. Yes, correct.
So the question is if it is native. But it is a new crop. It is one of the first newly created crops in like 10,000 years. I do not know, Andy might know also, any idea if it's a cross. Right, of indigenous?
Yeah, it is a cross of a variety of grasses and wheat. It's basically grass that's trained to behave like wheat. And they're also working now on a perennial wheat, which is a wheat that they're training to behave like grass. So it's a lot of hybridization, basically.
And, there are many other crops. Kernza is the most well-known, I think, of the research that's being done at the University of Minnesota, and there's things like hazelnuts, pennycress. There's a dozen different crops that they're working on. Hazelnuts is another interesting one. Hazelnuts, years ago, we just thought they could not grow here in Minnesota. It was just too cold. And Oregon and those places like that is where our hazelnuts come from. And what we found is that there's been a lot of research actually by a private individual who's done years of research to make it so that we can have hardy hazelnuts that grow here in Minnesota. And hazelnuts create an incredible amount of oil. There's a great opportunity, from what I understand, it can be as much per acre as soybeans. So it's not like we're going to lose capacity by going to this, and hazelnuts obviously being a tree that has great root structure that provides so much more than a soybean field would. So there's some really exciting things that I think like a university like Minnesota can really do to help advance a regenerative agriculture, as well as people that are on the ground like Rehi that I mentioned, just kind of doing innovative things there. Then another thing I'll mention is embracing traditional ecological knowledge. And I think this is part of my organization, Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, is really try to do this more and more, of recognizing we don't know what the answers are. We don't, and there's a lot of wisdom and truth to come from people that have been, continue to be on the ground and learning from that. Makoche Ag is at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, a really innovative group that is trying to do different things. They're actually using Ray-He's technique of poultry production, and bison are a critical component of what the Great Plains have been for millennia, and bringing them back is a great way of having food production as well as restoring the prairie landscape. So there's some really exciting research done by a lot of tribal communities on this. Then one more kind of highlight I'll mention, another one around research. This guy, Dr. David Johnson, so my background, I'm an environmental engineer. I did my master's thesis on nitrogen deposition and the movement of nitrogen in the system. I have a bias that I think of these systems as all about the nutrients and where the nutrients are. There's been so much interesting research lately, and if everyone's read like the mother tree, Suzanne Simard, and the role of mycorrhizal, I can never say that, mycorrhizal networks and the importance of the biology in the system. There's so much that we're learning about how important that biology is in native systems like a forest. We're also finding this, so this guy, Dr. David Johnson, is kind of leading some fascinating research on the importance of the fungi community in agricultural systems. And he has found that he can just make the production explode by having a fungal compost that he's helped create beyond the landscape, rather than a biological compost, which is what most of all of us create in our backyard. With a fungal compost that uses an anaerobic system, he's getting tremendous benefits from having just a very little of that fungal compost go on to the fields. So I point that out. It's just a whole different way of thinking that I never heard of 5-10 years ago, and it feels like it's kind of coming much more into the forefront of rethinking about, it's not just about the nutrients, it's not just about the physics and the nutrients of the system. There's an awful lot of biology that we are just kind of starting to tap into. So maybe I'm going to close this part by just saying one last thing. As Jackie nicely mentioned, I was a director of a fellowship program. These 3 individuals were all part of that fellowship program. Don Bustos, who's in New Mexico, who farms with this little drip of water that he has coming onto his farm. It is absolutely remarkable, the system that he has developed. He's an Indo-Hispanic origin. And he talks about how using the systems that they've had for centuries, the acequia system in the Southwest, of using water so efficiently. There's so much learning that we could have from that we don't have right now. Malik Yakini is in Detroit. He started D-Town Farms, rethinking about how we use our urban landscapes and the opportunity to grow a lot of food in an urban environment. I did not appreciate that before, how much food we can grow regeneratively in urban landscapes. And then Valley Seagrass, she's with the Muckleshoot tribe in Washington State, and looking at food as medicine, and walking around with her and just picking out all these wonderful things that I would consider a weed, that she sees all these different uses for. There's just so much to rethink that we don't hear about. I had this incredible opportunity to hear what these people were doing because of this fellowship program, but most of us have never heard this. It's below the radar screen of the dominant culture, and we're missing this great ingenuity that is happening. Okay, so now I'm going to go make a dramatic shift from these exciting new possibilities to what we can think about regarding policy and things like that. So we have a farm bill coming up. Farm bill comes around about once every 5 years. It's the biggest piece of private lands legislation in the country. It started in the Roosevelt, FDR days in the Depression and with the Dust Bowl, is trying to address those type of issues. We have a real opportunity with this farm bill right now. It is the best opportunity we have to address climate change at the federal level for this next year. There's $20 billion from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that's coming over to USDA for us to use that we need to protect. There's really a lot we can do around the farm bill, and that's how I'm spending an awful lot of my time right now. However, one thing I just want to mention regarding how we think about policy and how we think about farming and economics, we often think about we just like pizza. We like really greasy pizza. We're going to eat greasy pizza, and that's just what the system needs to provide us. And so that consumer that really likes that greasy pizza sends a price signal over to the food industry. Food industry takes that price signal and says, oh boy, I got to create a whole lot of corn. I got to create a whole lot of low quality cheese and other things to get that pizza for that person. And they send that price signal to the farmer. And so that farmer just says, hey, I got to grow what they got to grow, and that's the system we have. I really think that we have this in our minds quite a bit, that this is how the model works. What can we do? You know, we just like greasy pizza. When we have that kind of thought in our head, so if you are concerned, say, about the environment, and you're thinking, yeah, those farmers, they just grow a lot of pesticides that they're using. I wish they wouldn't use those pesticides. So we have the environmental community that really focuses on farmer behavior and says, you farmers, you stop this, we're going to provide an incentive for you not to do this, we're going to pass legislation for you to stop using this certain pesticide or whatnot. So we focus our efforts, the environmental community, on the farmer. Public health, they look and say, yeah, would you please stop eating that greasy pizza? Would you start eating better? And we yell at the consumer and saying, what is wrong with you? Start eating healthier. Because of that focus, the environmental side on the farmer, the public health side on the consumer, USDA, the vast majority of USDA programs come from the Farm Bill. This all kind of ties back to the Farm Bill. The USDA, if you look at the programs it has, the vast majority are about either changing consumer behavior or about changing farmer behavior, okay? We don't kind of look at what's in the middle, that food industry. Agribusiness is not in the Farm Bill. We don't talk about it. We kind of pretend it's not there. When I was younger, I've had this slide for a while. When I was younger, I used to kind of have the food industry kind of morph away, and then I would have Darth Vader come in, you know, breathing heavy and saying, and I'm not quite to that level anymore. And then for a while, I had a gorilla that would come in, and one of the things, there was a former University of Minnesota professor, Dr. Cochran, an economist, who would say, if you invite an elephant into your living room, it really doesn't matter if it's a good elephant or a bad elephant, it's going to break something. And I think there's some real truth to that we've invited an elephant into our food system. It's going to break things. We have to recognize that we have this much too big a system right there. So, as you all think about, and hopefully you are, activated to kind of be thinking about how we can make a better world, how we address climate change, how we address these other things, where do we spend our time? I have to say, like 15, 20 years ago, I was quite involved in kind of thinking about carbon markets and how can we develop a carbon market for farmers. I think that's good work, and I think that needs to happen and make them better. I don't want to spend my time on that anymore. Partly because the General Mills and the Cargills of the world, they're spending their time on that. That is moving forward. I think that's a thing that's happening, whether we like it or not, that's kind of happening. I want to spend my time on that right side of that, about more the emergent, where I don't really know what's going to happen. I'm not really sure what the outcomes are going to be, but I really feel like we need to be on that side. We have to be on that side of we just don't know, but we have to try different things that are different. We have to let those 1,000 flowers bloom and kind of think of different ways of moving forward. So finally, I'll just say what we are doing at Regenerative Agriculture Foundation. In that context of not really knowing, we are not going to go out there and say, hey, you farmer, you think we need you to go to cover crops over here. The next year, you're going to have a couple years of Kernza, and then you're going to do this. I absolutely do not think that's a solution to go in that direction. We more just want to help these small, innovative farmers, and particularly those of Black, Indigenous farmers of color that have not had the opportunity to, often not have the opportunity to have land, often not have the opportunity to have the capital to make change in their system. We want to help those flourish. And so we're spending an awful lot of our efforts on a program such as Restoring Regenerative Agriculture, where we're trying to say, rethink about what regenerative agriculture is and make it much broader and address kind of the social and things like farm worker justice and things like that. So that's where I've been spending my time. And I think that's probably a good time to stop right now. And just, I really appreciate this conversation. Would love to continue this about where we can go as communities, where we can do to help make the change that we want to see, how we can get involved in policy, how we can get involved in getting a greater diversity of farmers on the landscape, how we can make these changes here. I welcome having that conversation.
Let me make a comment on some visible progress. For, I suppose, 40 years, I've been making a twice-a-year trip down to western Kentucky, where I have family. And now I drive off the freeways through the countryside, and I've noticed that I would say in the last 15 years, there's a lack of any open, just dirt fields. They aren't there. There's always cover of some sort, even if it's cut off corn stalks, but oftentimes it's some kind of grass for cattle fodder, or a new crop, replacing the winter wheat and that sort of thing. Very little blow-away soil, and that is noticeable if you drive the farming country.
That's great to hear, and thank you. And I would say that we see a lot more of that in the southern part of the Midwest, in places like Kentucky. They're double cropping or cover cropping. I think that has really kind of taken off in a big way. There are some that say that it's a lot harder to do here in a place like Minnesota, where we have a shorter season and it's more difficult to get the cover crop established in time. But yeah, I'm confident that it can happen more and more, and can happen more here in the north. Yeah.
So I hear a lot about, big picture, very cutting edge ideas for making change. But how do you help, like, the family farmers that are in, for example, southwestern Minnesota, depending on corn and beans for their livelihood, because that's what they've done for years and years and years, and they have many, many issues that they have to face just to grow corn and beans.
Yeah.
So how do you help them start thinking about taking care of the soil when it's been working pretty well for them for quite a while?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I would say that there are several programs within USDA in the conservation title that are about that, about how we can make more progress, more cover cropping, more diversity, things like that. I would say one of the big things that we have missed the boat on is when these Farm Bill programs started with the New Deal, it was about looking at price and how dangerous it was to have very low prices and very high prices. We have gotten rid of that system right now, so we allow prices to go quite low, which is beneficial to the buyers of the crops. And so the buyers, the Cargills, the General Mills, they do better when the prices are low. And I think there's been a real incentive, and you can look at where the economic power is, there's more of an incentive to have low prices. So often the family farmers are suffering from very low prices and then need to have these government programs to pay them back, because they're essentially subsidizing this system. I've been part of a coalition that's been arguing for a long time that we need to have a way of keeping prices at a more moderated level so that they are not as low as they are. And that is one of the ways to help farmers have the economic viability to not only maintain the family farm, but then also to incorporate some of these practices. So I do think looking at the economics of it and how much that has been distorted is an issue. And I just also, you're absolutely right that we have developed the infrastructure between the grain mills, between the ethanol plants, the storage facilities. We have created an incredible infrastructure for a couple of crops, and that's not going to go away. So it's really hard to think, if you're in western Minnesota and you want to start growing apples, you have to be a really innovative, creative, and ambitious person to do that, to create those markets and lose that support that you get for growing corn. So we have created a system that kind of keeps people kind of locked into where they're at. So helping support more diversity and more risk-taking, I think, is a big part of it.
Hey, Mark, it's great to see you.
Good to see you, Andy.
I first saw Mark speak, and I think he likes boat metaphors. The Farm Bill as a huge, tanker, very hard to diverge from this path and make a turn. And now you had raft, kind of where our unbalanced system. So I guess kind of along those lines, I'm thinking about restoring regenerative agriculture, because I see it's a term that's relatively new to me, but that, large agribusiness companies are fully, I'd say, occupying and trying to define what it is, but it's not transformational so I just wanted you to, speak a little bit more to that, and maybe that gets into kind of the challenges of restoring it as well.
Yeah. That's a great question, Andy. And when I have the honor of having one of my colleagues, his name's Brett Ramey, he's with the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. And when I've talked to him about regenerative agriculture, it's largely and tribal communities have had a challenging relationship with agriculture. It has not worked very well for them. Their traditional food production has been a much different way than what we think of as agriculture. So his first take at regenerative agriculture was like, I'm not so excited about working with you at the Regenerative Ag Foundation. When we kind of came to this point about restoring regenerative agriculture, but trying to give it that transformational lens. that is more welcoming and accepting of going outside of the confines of where we often think of regenerative agriculture. And it is no surprise that the companies and many of the conventional farmers would like to have a fairly narrow definition of what regenerative agriculture is, regenerative practices, because we want to say that if you put in cover cropping, you can get paid this much per acre for doing that. It allows for a much more transactional relationship. From the colleagues that I've worked with, particularly in the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, it is much more about wanting a transformation and having this system and these transactions are not working for them. So I just wanted to kind of bust that out and just think more boldly about the change that we can make. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Andy, or where to go, but it is much more about thinking about the larger scale and incorporating the societal economic issues with the environmental issues has been kind of a key part that I've been in a learning journey about.
Great, no, thanks.
I wonder if this could go on another time, but to hear about which of the new methods works best for reducing the use of herbicides and pesticides, which is, of course, a way of reducing the cost of farming.
I will quickly say, if you want to learn more about that, there's a gentleman named Gabe Brown in North Dakota. Gabe was is a traditional, wheat, corn, soybean kind of farmer in North Dakota that was going out of business. And he was in a time of desperation. This must have been 20 years ago or so. And he just said, I have to do something. I can't afford to keep on paying these costs for the chemical and all that. And he just did a radical transformation into what he is now kind of considered one of the godparents of what regenerative agriculture is, where he's incorporated these systems of just not tilling at all, not using any herbicides, not using any fertilizers, because he's really kind of incorporated more of the natural systems in place. So I would say, welcome you to look at Gabe Brown and others that have kind of made that transition as a way of, and he did it largely from just trying to avoid chemical costs and became kind of this guru about what regenerative agriculture can be. So I do think there's some opportunities there.
Have you looked through the regenerative lens at lawn care and lawn replacement plants?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't know if you saw my lawn, I'm not sure if you would ask that question to me. I guess one thing I did do is I took out a good chunk of that and moved my gutters to capture the water in a rain garden and try to use that and then talk to experts to know what kind of plants could be grown in that rain garden. So rain garden is one possibility. But I got to say, like, I have 3 kids. They played soccer in that yard for years. And so we liked having a lawn. And now that they are kind of growing up and moving out of the house, I'm taking over more and more of that for these native plants. I think just anytime you can get more native plants in there, greater diversity, holding more of the water, not having the water go out into the boulevard and just flushing down, but being held by the soil, I think that's all the better. Great question. Well outside of my field, though.
I just wanted to mention, thank you for mentioning Gabe Brown. He's the subject of a fabulous movie called Kiss the Ground, which is on Netflix. And so that explains a lot of how this system works. And the other really cool thing is we're lucky we live in Minnesota because there's a wonderful organization called Sustainable Farming Association, and they work farmer to farmer, which is what Gabe does. It's, a farmer who's stuck on a corn-soy rotation is not going to listen to me, right? But they'll listen to each other. And when they see those changes happening next door, they're more likely to adapt some of those other. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, Mark, a lot of the traditional ecological knowledge that you're talking about, can you say a little more about our mindset of treating land as a commodity? Because I think that's a lot of it. You're talking about changing how we think about land, right?
Yeah, it is. I feel like, and I'm making the presumption that many of you are from a largely white background like me, and we kind of came at this from, I had the real benefit of having my ancestors come from Ireland and getting to have the opportunity to farm here and being given plots of land. And something I never questioned before, but then kind of thinking about, okay, where did that land come from? Who owned that land before? And how that kind of commoditized, the start of the commoditization of this whole system. The other interesting thing also is that, we're really, as we remember, like the Homestead Act in the 1860s and all that, we're really trying to get more white people to come out to the Midwest, and by giving the free land, and then having the railroads come out there, and not having many markets here in the Midwest. And so we kind of created a system that forced people to get into grains and oil seeds and other durable commodities so that we can send that wheat and send that corn back to the East Coast. So we kind of started this system that was very much commoditized, where you couldn't have more of that relationship with your neighbors, where you grew a whole bunch of asparagus and someone grew the apples and you worked that together. It was much more of a kind of get more of that stuff out to the East Coast. So we started, I really feel like we started this system here really strongly based on the commoditization of the land. And then, you know, as I think as we've continued to recognize the atrocities, particularly to Native communities, particularly about slavery, and thought, okay, we're going to make things, we'll try to make things better, and we're going to give some land over here, or we're going to give back some land over there. And it was still, and I think that that's much needed, and reparations are something that's in our future. And also, it's a continuation of that kind of colonized mindset that we have. And it often does not work in the tribal communities. This Makoche Ag that I've been working with in Pine Ridge Reservation, they, you know, it's much more communal. It is a communal farm that's been started, and it's much more about how we all can work together and participate. It's just a different mindset. And I feel like I'm just trying to grasp how much my mind has been essentially colonized, and how to think, and how we can change it and kind of take a step back and realize, yeah, this is one system. This family farm system is a system that kind of worked pretty well for, you know, 80 years or so. It's kind of, it served us quite well. And it's just one system that's out there. There's so many other ways of having food production. And just taking a step back and thinking, yeah, maybe there's other ways that we should be thinking about, particularly as our you know, the Minnesota River is in such bad shape and all that. Maybe we should take a step back. So I really appreciate that question, Beth, and you know, I feel like I'm on a journey trying to learn how we address that, the commoditization, not only of the land, but our kind of the whole way of thinking about this.
I have a question. I have relatives like near Wilmer that are farmers, and I'm thinking about, you know, they're family farmers, and so the farm's going to go on to my nephew, and I'm wondering how you're working within that system of like, are you coming into like the higher education? Because he'll go to school to become a farmer. And are you in those systems disrupting what they're being taught? How are you reaching the future farmers?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And part of it is there's been a lot of progress that's been made. In Minnesota, University of Minnesota has this group called MISA, the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, that has been a great organization for providing a lot of courses that weren't offered before, and giving people to be able to have at least a minor, maybe a major now, in sustainable agriculture. Iowa State, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Ag. There are, in the heart of this corn and bean country, there is a lot of new progress that's being made. It is slow. And I gotta say, like talking to some colleagues at Iowa State University, they feel really lonely there. It's hard to be working in a system that is so focused on corn and soybeans. And you know, and I think just the thing I want to stress is just how I don't think we should and have like, well, maybe we can be angry, but it's just, these are people that are in a system that's just not working for them. And I don't want to feel animosity toward them at all. It's just like, how can we work together? How can we all kind of move the system forward in different ways? And so like having your nephew learn some new things as he goes to college is this one step in that program. Having more land available for people who have never been able to farm before is another system. But I hope it is like a both and, that we move this whole system forward in different ways.
I think it's curious where they live, for their church offering, they get crops. So that system is even supporting the whole entire community. You don't give money, you give them the soybeans, and then the church decides when to make their profit and everything. Like that is, it's so big, it's so wrapped in that community.
Yeah.
It's not just the farmer, it's also the church.
Right. Well, that's fascinating.
Last one. Farmville's coming up. To our representatives and our two senators, are we getting to them saying this, we have to change some of these things for environmental good?
Yeah. So great question. So I would say Senator Klobuchar and Senator Smith have both been pretty good champions on the Ag Committee for kind of having a more comprehensive look at what we have in agriculture. You know, we were on the House side, Congressman Colin Colin Peterson was the Ag Committee Chair for like 20 years, so he kind of had a big say in how things went. We don't quite have the influence that we used to have. I would say, and the other thing I would say is that it is really important that we do a better job of having all sides of the political spectrum be involved in these issues. And I think we have a lot of urban legislators that are quite good on different things, and some senators, but we got to make sure we know how to speak to rural legislators. We have to know, and conservative Republican legislators that often are having a different vision. So I do think that's something that we've missed the boat on some.
I hate to draw this discussion to a close because it's been fascinating. And Mark, thank you so much for bringing some clarity to this.
Thank you. Great to meet all of you.
And please join us next week when Taylor Smikarova, Property Development Director of Redesign, will talk to us about their work toward equitable development in the recovery of East Lake Street. So please come back. Thank you.